Professor Almeida and dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we change gears now, and I would like to just delineate past experiences with national and international myocarditis registries. Of course, this will not be a complete review, it's a personal impression, but maybe you will get some information out of it. We start over with what we did in our local and regional area at the Philipps University in Marburg, what we did in the German competence net of heart failure, what we did together with the European Society and with the World Heart Federation. And I'm grateful to all those who participated in this type of learning experience. And lessons to learn from registries are the following. I think one has to first pose the question what a registry can achieve. Also, it's not an RCT, and it's not a substitute for it. So you have to define very clearly what you want to get out of that registry. And then, of course, the predefined purpose is important. Is it more an epidemiological or a technical aspect? Do you want to compare different imaging methods in the myocardial biopsy with MRI, or do you want just do epidemiology? And also it's important, of course, the question who will finance it. Do you have local funds, grants, hospital funds, or no funds at all? And the latter is, of course, most of the time detrimental for any registry attempt. And I think for me, one of the most important questions was who will do the real work? Yeah, we discussed many things, but those who will be dedicated to the clinical work are most important ones. They will do the paperwork and the documentation, and at the end I think we have to find out who will benefit. It's not only the PI who can and should benefit, there should be more people who take a benefit out of it, and then of course we have to discuss where to publish it if the data are worthwhile at all. Now those prerequisites and lessons learned from what I have experienced with registries is, of course, that it is important to have a baseline data set. It should be comprehensive, but it should not be overloaded. And then you need, of course, informed consent for the patient and of the patient, for the database and for the biobank and for the biologicals. You will also need and assemble interested and motivated parties, hospitals and international groups. And as I pointed out already, all contributors should benefit, not only the PI. And in a time where short-term results are important for scientific funding, long-term results should not be neglected. They may be even more important than the short-term results. And then, of course, the general impression is retrospective registries will often reveal the problems of sufficient data acquisition. This should be the beginning of a sincere scientific bias, and therefore this can be only avoided by a prospective registry where data acquisition is separated from its statistical analysis. Now I would like to go down these different forms of registries where I had an own experience. There are local registries, national registries and international registries. And you will see that with the local registry, there's one where I was looking over the fence. This was the Homburg-Tübingen registry on the prospective registry on the prognosis of myocarditis. And this registry, I think, is important because important data came out of it. And Hans-Peter already alluded to one of those. This is the positive immunohistology, the infiltrating cells that make the difference for a poor prognosis in a patient that were not untreated for myocarditis, except for heart failure. The second important information was that at least in this local registry, there was no real benefit just from probing for virus positivity and virus negativity. However, if you take both together, then it is a positive viral etiology and a positive result for inflammation that makes the difference between those patients that will then succumb to death. This was the endpoint: freedom from heart failure and freedom from transplantation when compared to those who have both the virus and, in addition, an inflammation at the first biopsy. Now, I would like to turn to the Marburg myocarditis registry and our data bank, and very similar things I think Hans-Peter Schultheis has experienced with the Berlin registry, and this was something I would like to show you in the next slides. We use, of course, endomyocardial biopsy in those patients. We started with a local concept on what is inflammation, and we defined at that time inflammation or active myocarditis as 14 leukocytes or more, and necrosis. This was active myocarditis. Then chronic myocarditis, same amount or more of leukocytes per square millimeter, but degeneration and necrosis was not obligatory, and of course no myocarditis if there are less than 14 infiltrating cells. This was the first start of what then became a concept which was expanded to a consensus document by the World Heart Federation. What we can find with this type of immunohistochemistry is, of course, we can define chronic myocarditis with anti-CD45 positive cells. We can look for anti-CD3 positive cells. We can define acute myocarditis. You see that the anti-CD4 positive brown spots are much more frequent in chronic myocarditis. And we can look, of course, also in granuloma-forming cells, like here in a cardiac sarcoid, and you see that in the controls this is negative. So I would like to stress that from a local concept to an international agreement, this could be very helpful to advance then the possibilities of defining what acute and what chronic myocarditis is. And you find those data also with respect to PCR-based forms of myocardial inflammation. This is the registry or the biopsy bank in Berlin. This is our own data bank, and you see that what Sabine Pankowait has published in 2003 also still applies today. We have a large cohort of parvobin-19 positive patients with an ejection fraction of more, but also less than 45%. There is an increase of incidence of parvobin-19 if the ejection fraction is low, and this is associated with inflammation in more than 1,000 patients. We have also patients with no inflammation but virus positivity, but this is by incidence lower. And still important is that with respect to inflammation and an ejection fraction of below 45% or even a little bit above, then virus negative ones make up the largest cohort, at least in our Marburg registry. This is a little bit different in the Berlin registry, but in principle we have similar results and the direction is very comparable. So this is a success story of local registries, and those then have been expanded to regional registries. We have expanded our local registry to a European study. This is the SSID trial. I show you the preliminary data on the prognosis, and what you can see when compared to placebo patients who get immunosuppression in the long run. This is a little bit different from the TIMIC trial by Professor Frustaci. We see it in the long run that they will benefit after years. So you need a long-term breathe to just make the follow-up of those patients to find out the difference between verum and placebo. And this is also a beneficial type of developing from a local concept into an international study. And I know that Hans-Peter with the big trial did something very similar, and I think he should comment to this in the discussion. Our own experience also with IV immunoglobulin treatment started with a local initiative and will be then go into the IMPARC trial, where we want to test if intravenous immunoglobulins are beneficial. Our own cohort and our local initiative is now more than 350 patients, but we want to have that then done in low dose and high dose immunoglobulin treatment. We know that the immunoglobulins can work against inflammation, and this is particularly true to the fact that there is an anti-inflammatory activity by the serialization of the end-linked glycan of the IgG-Fc receptor in those patients. If we look in our local cohort for the long-term follow-up of those patients, you see that with an IV IgG treatment, here about 250 patients, the benefit is persisting. It's going down in those who have not received IV IgG, and those patients were primarily those that had PALB19 in their endomyocardial biopsy. And similarly, we started with a local concept which is updated for CMV myocarditis. You see that if you treat those patients with high-dose immunoglobulins, in the active treatment arm, there is a clear reduction of cellular infiltrates and of CMV DNA. In the controls, there is little, and there is a significant difference between this. Now, this is a rare form of myocarditis. We have not expanded this so far into a regional or national or international registry or cohort. But what came out of those local and national types of registries are, of course, guideline forms for our own hospital and for our own area. For fulminant myocarditis, you see the central role after imaging in those patients in a complete clinical workup. Biopsy is important to distinguish fulminant inflammation with or without giant cells, or with or without virus positivity, and then we can select them and offer them either in treatment trials or open label in a registry, a treatment either by immunosuppression if there is no virus, be it giant cell myocarditis, cardiac sarcoid, or autoreactive myocarditis, or they go into a treatment trial or treatment arm in acute viral myocarditis, and this is immunomodulatory therapy. In our own setting, it is IV immunoglobulins. This has been published recently. And very similarly, in inflammatory-related cardiomyopathy and myocarditis, you have also the very same algorithm. Do first clinical workup, do the imaging methods, including MRI and echocardiography, look for biomarkers of inflammation. I have listed them here, and then do endomyocardial biopsy, because only then you will be in the position to classify the form of myocarditis as virus-positive myocarditis, autoreactive myocarditis, or viral heart disease, or no myocarditis at all. You see the line of scrimmage of 14 lymphocytes and macrophages per square millimeter as defined by the WHF criteria, and then you can treat them specifically and follow them up in registries or in treatment trials, and although this has been published recently. I would finally turn to the Marburg Pericarditis Registry, which is a close cooperation between Belgrade University and our own institution. In this situation, we have looked for intrapericardial treatment with triamcinolone in those patients, have published this some years ago, and from that on, you see that intrapericardial triamcinolone in autoreactive pericarditis is helpful. No recurrence after 3 and 6 months in those patients who have received 600 milligram per square meter for 24 hours, when compared to those who have not received triamcinolone, and there's almost no difference if there is a lower dose of intrapericardial triamcinolone. From this, we have also developed a local guideline which shows us that in patients that have pericardial effusion, gentamicin as a sclerosing therapy and triamcinolone is helpful. In autoreactive and lymphocytic pericardial effusion, you have the local therapy with very little systemic side effects available in those patients. These and others have been part of guidelines on the diagnosis and management of pericardial diseases, which I was very happy to chair some years ago, and from those local registries we have expanded to a Tempus project, and we have also written just recently a book that has appeared on interventional pericardiology. Now, finally, when looking at national registries, the German competence net on heart failure with 12 sub-projects and one that has been done by Sabine Pankowait and myself on the predisposition of myocarditis and dilated cardiomyopathy is also a very helpful experience. And if you look at this, you will find that important data are that for the funding, enough money is available. This was quite fair for all those who participated. There was always the demand for an added value by the cooperation between the different projects, which is a mandatory. And then baseline data set are obligatory for each patient. We had to fill out at least 4 pages of this baseline data set, but this is a real treasure for future publications. And then central data management and statistics, independent from the local area, is important. And the biobank was also located centrally in Berlin, close to Professor Dietz and his chair. And then the continuity of the BMBF financing by the structure and making this then a structural continuity, I think, is also important to have a possibility to share the treasure of the bio and data bank with others. And of course, continuous communication with all those who participated is important, and therefore we had in those patients what we call the heart failure newsletter. You see examples of those. Communication is important for networking. And at the end, of course, the continuity in financing by the consortium, which the Italians have shown us how to do it, like the GISI, for example, I think would be the best option in the future, though this is also a success story. I just show you what we had to do for our own project every year, and this is one of the follow-ups where you can see that we have to look for genetics of carb, myosin, and cadherin. We have published data on those. We have planned also on toll-like receptors, ICAMs, and so forth. And if you look at this, you see that this is something which you can do only if you collaborate with other groups and with other institutions. So coming at the end to international registries, the international consensus on myocarditis and the definition of myocarditis, I showed this previously, was one of those where we were very happy about, and this definition is still widely accepted. I think it's better than the Dallas criteria. So I would like to summarize my own experience. I think it started with local registries. They were expanded then in either to international studies or at least to guidelines in the part of pericarditis. And in the Berlin registry, very similar things have occurred. We have looked for national registries in Germany primarily. I have looked on the heart failure network, which has dedicated projects with respect to myocarditis and ECMI. I have shown you that international registries are important. The Japanese should be mentioned. They are excellent in doing those registries, at least on cardiomyopathies. I showed you that the consensus meeting was a success, but we had also the negative experience of a WHF registry trial where there was a lack of funding and then this trial failed. So the pros and the cons for registries, I think, was one of the things I wanted to show you with my own personal experience. I should like to thank you for your kind attention and show you again how successful those things can be by the smileys, where we still are working on our IMPARC and Magica, and I showed you the failing ones. I think also bad experiences are lessons to learn. So thank you again for listening, and also for all collaborators locally and also our national and international partners.